can you lose the rewards that you've gained in life? Like, for instance, okay, let's say there's a missionary who gave his entire life to God and to the ministry and all that. He did great things. People got saved, demons were cast, all these different things. And then, in his later years, he fell away. Is it like he never did any of that? It doesn't count? Or does God remember the good that he did even while punishing the wicked? It's a difficult question. I want to hear your guys' take on this. Yes. Questionable whether he would go to heaven. It's at least a gray area. So, worst case, yes, full-on apostasy. Best case, sliding on in there. What do you think? You would say what? Okay, so you're thinking, probably sounds like it's all or nothing, though, with the whole Paul finishing the race. Okay. Did it affect other people? Tell me a little more about that. So like compounding sin. Your sin leading other people to sin. Okay, all right. And there would be some biblical warrant for that too. Jesus does mention some things that seems to talk about that, so you might be onto something there. Were you going to say anything else about that? Okay, so you're saying there's a possibility that the punishment in hell would be maybe better or worse depending on how it all went down. Okay. Danny, go ahead. So you're saying definitely, the same as you lose, all the years that you weren't on alcohol. Okay, all right. Let me follow that up with a question. And if you still want to answer the first question, that's fine. But let me just a follow-up question too. So when you do a job, if you don't finish the job, you still get paid for the job, part of the job that you did do. So are we saying that does not apply as far as the eternal rewards? What was that? Ooh, man. So how do you think then that applies to this then? Okay, so let me think about this. You're saying the half down would be people, the reward from people. The other half would be the reward from God. Okay. So The opinions of others, okay. Hmm. That's funny. Grace? What parable are we talking about? Okay. No, I know which one you're talking about now. For those, if there's anyone watching online, she's talking about the parable where the different people start at different times of the day, but they all get paid the same pay. And how were you tying that into this? Okay, so the people who finished got paid. I get it. Yep, got it. Okay. Any other thoughts on this? So there's an interesting thought. I'll repeat it for the people if there's anyone online. She said it's kind of like you have to be there to claim the reward. Like if you finish the race and you win, then you take off too early and you don't get the prize, which is that's good. Okay, so some very what? Okay, so this is fantastic. We're going to open this up, guys. this is fantastic. So the question is basically flipping it over and saying, okay, instead of the faithful person who lost their rewards, the person who was immoral their whole life, and then at the very end they got saved before they went to heaven, and so they did end up going to heaven. What would be their rewards? Whenever we're talking about stuff like this, I always feel a little bit silly because have you ever been, you know what, you remember in high school where all the popular kids were having their popular parties? You were just happy to be in the door, weren't you? I kind of feel like that with heaven. Like I'm just happy to be in the door. Like you can stick me wherever you want me. That's fine. I'm happy to be here. Grace? Okay. So not very many rewards, but still be able to be there. Okay. Okay. Any further ideas on this? Okay. Okay. So let me ask you a question, and you tell me if this is what you're saying. Are you saying that the good things that they did, even though they weren't saved when they did them, that those would be counted towards them as like worthy of a reward if they did accept Jesus? Okay. Okay. Okay, as long as it's done with a good attitude. Okay. Okay. So if it's more of a thing of trying to be genuine and not something of trying to be, manipulating people. Sure. Okay. 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 Anything else before we move on? I want to make sure everybody who wanted to say something did. Mm-hmm. So follow-up thought to that, and we're not going to delve into this tonight, but just a follow-up thought. There are some things said in Revelation about different positions given that are worth thinking about. There's also the question that when the crowns are laid down, do they stay there? I don't know. Well, I mean, I would like, so I'd like to build a little, go in my house, and I have a little, this is my crown. I don't want to brag, it's a little bit bigger than Gracie's, so, I mean, I'm not keeping score, but evidently God was keeping score, so, I'm joking. Okay, let's move forward here. So, and last week we were looking at the way that your faith will push you forward, and that took us from verses 19 through 25. But tonight we're going to look through a lengthy section, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on any of the one verses, so don't get too scared. And so the section we're looking at tonight is 26 through 39. And can I have somebody read these verses? Dost thou dare? Gonna start poking at people. Shane? Okay. I got him.
For if we deliberately go on sinning after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire about to consume the adversaries. Anyone who disregarded the law of Moses died without mercy, based on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think one will deserve who has trampled on the Son of God and who has regarded as profane the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and who has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know the one who has said, "Vengeance belongs to me, I will repay," and again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Remember the earlier days when, after you had been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to the taunts and afflictions, and at other times you were companions of those who were treated that way. For you sympathized with the prisoners and accepted with joy the confiscation of your possessions, because you know that you yourselves have a better and enduring possession. So don't throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you need endurance, so that after you have done God's will, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while the coming one will come and not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith, and if he draws back, I have no pleasure in him. But we are not those who draw back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and are saved.
Okay. So let's see what we got here. Now, the return of Jesus is the main theme that ended last week, and also it's the main theme that ends this verse here. It's kind of brackets the section. So just to recap from last week, verse 25, it says, all the more as you see the day approaching, and then he gets into verse 26 where we started today, and then you get towards the end of the section that we're looking at today, toward close to like 37 and whatnot, and it says, yet in a very little while the coming one will come and not delay. So you can see that the return of Jesus is a main focus here for continuing on, basically remembering that this home is not our eternal home, that there are other things at stake, there's other things coming. And so then you get to verse 26, and it says this, "For if we deliberately go on sinning." Now, remember I told you whenever there's a therefore, look what it's there for. Well, this "for" is a little bit misleading, because he's not saying, you remember the stuff from last year? Since we have the confidence, let us draw near and let us watch out for one another and all that stuff. He's not tying this into that. So another way of saying that is he's not saying, if you don't draw near, it's a sin, and if you deliberately go on sinning, you won't be forgiven. That's not what he's saying. Okay? What he is saying is that if we back off from the faith, knowing the truth and knowing that the end is coming, there will be no forgiveness. That's what he's saying. So, in fact, in the NIV, it just drops the "for" in total because it causes a little bit of confusion. So it just goes, if we deliberately go on sinning. And I think that honestly is probably a little bit better in light of the context than the CSB's rendering of it. But it's as long as you understand that he's not saying that if you don't draw near, that's the deliberate sin that he's talking about. He's not doing that. So then we get to, so what does deliberate mean? Well, it's important to clarify what is and what is not being said. First off, he's not saying if we go on sinning. He said if we go on deliberately sinning. And there's a very big difference here, because basically everybody's going to sin. Right? You're going to sin every day. You're going to sin every week. Things happen. You lose your temper and say something stupid. You think something stupid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, everybody's going to do something and mess up. Well, except for Jesus. But, all of us are. And but what he's talking about is a deliberate thing, something that you know what's right and you still do the wrong thing anyway. So remember, once again, drawing back to the books of the law, there's going to be a bunch of these things. He says, okay, when you do this and you do this. But then right smack dab in the book of Numbers, he says, now if you do this, you won't be forgiven for that. And then it goes on to give tangible evidence for what he's talking about with Korah's rebellion and with all the different things that happen there. And it kind of, if you read through Numbers, look where the laws are placed and then where the stories are placed. And they do this thing where they'll sandwich a law with these stories to help you understand what it means by something that's not forgivable, right? So when Korah led a rebellion against the leaders, even though God made Moses, he made it clear that Moses was his servant. He made it clear that this was his message. Korah still rose up in rebellion against him. After all these grand miracles had happened, after he had already seen all the things that God had done. So then it goes on to talk about that. So deliberate sin is not so much sinning so much as you know what's right to do and you still didn't do it. So you could describe it as high-handed, or if you would want to say a kind of sin where you're not struggling against a sin, you're just kind of doing it openly. I'm going to do that. So here we have a definition as deliberate, high-handed rebellion. And I think that kind of really summarizes what's being said here. It's a high-handed rebellion where you're saying, no, I'm going to do this. I know what the right thing is to do, God. I know what you've said. I'm not going to do it. Now, we all do this in smaller amounts throughout our lives. And when you do this, okay, don't make a habit of it. Be quick to admit your failure to God and correct it if you can. But if you can't, still go to God and repent. That's the best thing you can do. But there's going to be little things where God will give you a prompt and you'll miss it, or you'll just kind of don't really want to do that. Like he'll say, hey, don't do that. Don't take that job. And you say, well, this job really looks good though. And so you take it and it's like, okay, all right, well, I told you not to do that. So then you have a bunch of problems that happen. I'm not saying you lose your salvation from that, but if you get in these kinds of patterns in life, it gets you into very dangerous areas. Like I was talking about earlier, a gray area where it's like, well, I'm not the one who decides where is the line when you actually lose your or give up your salvation. But there is a line somewhere, and obviously God knows that. So they wanted to know, remember, last week and the week before, we were looking at the Jewish question of why was one sacrifice enough to make all the difference? And so they were asking that. But the author here, after answering that question, kind of flips it around and says, okay, yes, one sacrifice was enough, and this is why. But if you reject that one sacrifice, there is now no longer any sacrifice available to you. He says there in verse 26, there no longer remains a sacrifice for that sin. So the section from last week and the week before was talking about the one sacrifice being sufficient. Okay, but here the stubbornness and rejection is exempting themselves from that sacrifice. So that takes us once again to the where can I lose my salvation? Well, you can exempt yourself by high-handed rebellion against the only sacrifice that, and this is important because they're wanting to go back to Judaism, and he's basically saying, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Jesus is the final sacrifice to rule all sacrifices, if you want to word it like that, and you want to go back to a lesser sacrifice, it's never going to work. So this often, when you get to this place of exempting yourself, this often doesn't come all at once. And the example that I can best use is when you leave a church. Okay, nobody goes to a church for years and then just wakes up one day and says, "I'm not going there anymore." They don't do that. Typically, there's little things, and they get more and more hurt, or they get themselves offended, or whatever happens. It's a gradual thing where you get to the place and say, "Well, this isn't my church anymore." If you remember, I actually talked about this a lot when I first got here, about how you can get to a place of saying, "I just don't know this church anymore." And it happens to us if we don't grow with the church. Think of it kind of like a train. The train is moving. If you're on the train, you're going to get left at the station. It's the exact same kind of idea. And I think that that's the best example of how we can get to that place of exempting ourselves from our salvation. We allow a little bit of sin in, a little bit of hurt, a little bit of, this and that, and we maybe stop reading the Bible as much and stop praying. And it's just things that aren't going to make us lose our salvation or something, but just a little bit more and a little bit more until we get to the place like this congregation has gotten, where they're kind of just exempting themselves from it. It didn't happen overnight, but they gradually got to the place. Now, the bad thing about warning people is you can warn somebody as many times as you want, but they ultimately really aren't going to listen until they've personally experienced it. When I first came here, I warned about a lot of things that was going to happen, a lot of offenses that were going to come. I warned about, people are going to leave, things are going to happen. And when that happens, don't get scared, don't get nervous. We're just going to keep going forward. And that stuff happened. And people didn't believe me. And over the past couple of months, I've had people, kind of having a bit of a hard time with me because the things that I told them was going to happen happened. You know what I mean? And I was actually talking to somebody a couple weeks ago, and I told them, I was saying, I've actually considered asking for a revote for me as a pastor now that people see how I pastor and what's going to happen. Because basically you have two options left for any church, not just for this, for any church. You can go back to just having a pastor that has no vision, or you can have a pastor that has vision and people leave. And you can't have it can't have it both ways, because if you have a pastor with no vision, the church will not grow and we will not have an impact. But if you do have a pastor with vision, you get what I'm saying here? So I warned people when I first came here about this, and the stuff still happened. The exact same thing is happening here in Hebrews. They've been warned, but we don't believe things when people warn us. It doesn't matter how much experience they have. It doesn't matter what they know. If they warn us, we just have this way of being hard-headed, and it's like, no, that's not going to happen. In one ear and not the other. And then when it happens, we get all upset. And I feel like that's exactly what's happening here in the book of Hebrews. So when you get in sin, when you start hardening your heart, you get to a place of rejecting God yourself. It's not something that happens overnight, but we get there. It kind of builds up. And even Christians get hard. See, I was talking about this last Sunday. We read verses, and we just instantly discredit them. But you have to remember, we're not just talking about Christians, those are the unfaithful, the bad Christians who left the faith. All of us are prone to hardness of heart. All of us. It's not something just the bad eggs no, this is something that can happen to all of us. So when we get to verse 27, it says this: "But a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire about to consume the adversary." So there's two things this tells us. Number one, you know the truth, but you refuse to obey the truth. And the second thing that this verse tells us is that these people become God's adversaries. They become God's adversaries. Don't look at people who have left the faith as somehow less than you. Look at people who have left the faith as people who didn't heed the warning, because it can happen to each of us. I remember there were certain people in throughout my years in ministry that I saw them as untouchable people. They would never abandon the faith. They would never leave the ministry, and then they did. And it shook me really bad, and it caused me to reevaluate myself, because I realized if they could fall, anyone could. You guys remember Swaggart? Not Zweigert. Yeah, Zweigert. And then the other guy, too. And the things that happened there, you guys remember that? With the whole, you guys remember that. Yeah, it was a little bit rocking for a lot of people because, I mean, these two guys were big deals. There was another one just a couple weeks ago. There was another one who committed suicide a couple months ago. I mean, these are big mega pastors, people well known, you know, who everybody knew these people, and even they fell. There has to be a point in our lives when we say, look, none of us are on a pedestal. These Christians in Hebrews, they had done great things. They were strong Christians. They didn't endured a lot. But you can't ever get to the place of saying these are untouchable. These will never fall. That's just silly. And we do this, and this is why I really want to hammer this in here, because we do the same thing in every aspect of our marriage. When we're young, right? We get married and we're in love. I would never cheat on my spouse because we're young, right? But then what happens when you get older and trials come by and things don't go so well, and then maybe your wife starts being distant and you can't have relations very often, and then maybe you get some health things. Well, then all of a sudden enter side character, and all of a sudden it becomes very easy to imagine how much better your life would be if you just... See what I mean? These things happen to us, and when you put a wall around yourself and say, it can never happen to me, you're setting yourself up for failure. That's pride that will come before a fall. So then we get to verse 28 and says this: anyone who disregarded the law of Moses died without mercy, based on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So even in the Old Testament, which was a lesser revelation than Jesus Christ himself, it was still that way, that harsh. Christ's mercy doesn't make things softer, it makes it harder. A lot of times when the culture talks about Jesus, they have this image of Jesus that's not accurate. He's loving and merciful and kind, and he is those things. He is those things. But because of that kindness, what that means for us is in Jesus' loving and merciful revelation, that means that the punishment for rejecting it is harsher, not softer. If people have a problem with the Old Testament, kill all the Canaanites, they're really going to have a hard time with the New Testament, kill the whole world who rebels against Jesus. I mean, this is a harsh message. It's not something that can just be taken down lightly, and I think that this is something that isn't really connected with the reality of the doctrine of Jesus. A partial Jesus instead of the full picture of Jesus. So punishment under Christ is harsher, not easier. Verse 29 then says this: how much worse punishment do you think one will deserve who has trampled on the Son of God, who has regarded as profane the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and who has insulted the Spirit of grace? So there's 3 things here. There are 3 different sins that he just mentioned of, how did I word it on that sheet? The 3 sins of apostasy. That's how I worded it. The first one there that he said was disdain for Jesus. Showing a disdain for Jesus. And once again, we talked about this last Sunday, this is not so much a thing of your emotions. You could genuinely be distraught. You could genuinely feel bad about it. It's not about disdaining somebody. It's not about your feelings. It's about your actions. When you do this, you are showing disdain for Christ. That's the first thing. The second thing he says is by treating Christ's blood as unclean, the blood of the new covenant. So when people get to the place of abandoning the faith, they use a few typical excuses. Sometimes it'll be like, I got my feelings hurt. Sometimes it'll be something like, well, I was in this rough situation. It just didn't really feel like God was there for me, or whatever. Whatever the excuses, there'll be the excuses. And the thing is, people use the excuses as a way of kind of lying to themselves about what they're actually doing. Regardless of whatever the excuse is, ultimately it's hardness of heart that leads to treating Christ's blood as unclean. And basically what you're saying is that Christ's blood is unfit. You're preferring the blood of animals to it. And then the third sin of apostasy he mentions in this verse is to insult or offend or to blaspheme or to outrage the Holy Spirit, who prompts us. He's the one who's giving us that inner work, who's guiding us in our life. And when we go back to this, we are literally insulting him. Think of it as kind of like smacking him in the face or spitting in his face. So he's not talking about a sinner who never believed. And this is the thing that blows me away. He's talking about in this really harsh language that he uses. this really harsh language that he's using here, he's talking about people who believed and then fell away, not the sinners of the world who never believed. That's an amazing statement. He's basically saying you're worse off if you believed and then fell away than if you never even heard. All these sinners that we look down on, they're going to be better off on the day of judgment than us if we abandon the truth of Jesus, if we abandon the message of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus. Those are some pretty, pretty offensive words there. So then we get to verse 30, and it says this. For we know the one who has said, vengeance belongs to me, I will repay, and again, the Lord will judge his people. Now both of these verses quoted here are actually citations from Deuteronomy 32, which is known as the Song of Moses. Moses is getting ready to die at the end of Deuteronomy. They're outside the promised land, the people of Israel outside the promised land, and he writes a song. And in the song, Moses is warning about apostasy, and that's a section that is being quoted here, but also in that very same section, he encourages people who are struggling. So chapter 32, verse, maybe verse 32, the end of the verse, the beginning is the Lord will judge his people, but the verse ends like this. Oh, I wrote it down. Yes. Deuteronomy 32, 36b. And have compassion on his servants when he sees that their strength is gone and no one is left, slave or free. See, there's a clear distinction in Deuteronomy that's being made between people who are committing apostasy and people who are messing up. And here's the thing. A lot of times we can't tell the difference. Somebody will go through a rough patch, or they'll be going through, struggling with a sin, and it looks like they're apostatizing, committing apostasy. And the whole time, we don't know their heart. They're not. And so here in Deuteronomy, in the Song of Moses, he's actually drawing a line in the sand between those that God is going to judge versus those who God is going to have compassion on when he sees that their strength is gone. And so if you're in a place where you are genuinely seeking God, but you are just struggling and messing up, have heart. Because Deuteronomy tells us he will have compassion on those when their strength is gone. It's those who are high-handed rebelling against God who he doesn't have compassion on, because it's done from pride, and God rejects that pride. He rejects the proud person. So then we get to verse 31, which says, it is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And the reason why it says this is because did it say it there in verse 30? Vengeance belongs to me, I'll repay, and the Lord will... Yes, okay, so it did say that. So in this part of the Song of Moses that is being cited here, it says very, very clearly that God is the one who is personally handling the apostatizers, those who are committing apostasy. It's God personally handling that I will repay. The Lord will do this thing. Not, so it's something that he is personally handling it. And that's a very terrifying thought. I kind of get a little bit, your hands get a little bit sweaty when like a cop turns on his lights. Oh, you know that? And we're not talking about a cop here. We're talking about God coming after you. I mean, that's kind of scary. So it's a very terrifying thought. It's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Now, just as a general rule, whenever you see the New Testament quoting the Old Testament, there's a few things to kind of keep in mind, and that's this. Old Testament citations compare... No, I'll come back to that. When the Old Testament is cited, it'll do this in a way where they reference the entire passage while highlighting one place. Okay? So you only hear the one verse that he's quoting, but he is actually quoting the whole passage. This is just kind of how they cited things back in that period of time. So he's going to say one thing, and he's drawing to mind the whole passage. So when you read these, whenever you read in the New Testament that they're citing something from the Old Testament, go back and read that part that they're citing in the Old Testament, and in most of your Bibles, it's going to be in the subnotes at the very bottom of the page, most of the time, or in the center section or something. Go back and read where he's citing, because typically he's drawing attention to that whole verse, that whole context there. Another way of saying that is when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it's quoting the thought, not just the verse. So kind of keep that in your mind. It's something that's really helped illuminate a lot of verses I've studied in my own life, and I'm sure it'll help you too. So now going back to the other thing that I was going to say. When the Old Testament cites when the New Testament cites this part of the Old Testament, that's what I'm trying to say. He's drawing, what is it called? He's implying a comparison to his audience. He's basically saying, you Jews who are rebelling against Jesus, you are like those Jews who were rebelling against God then. So it's a way of kind of drawing attention to an ongoing issue, an ongoing problem, which hopefully the audience will hear and stop doing it. And he has the best of hopes. That's how he ends this verse on, and we're going to ends this chapter on. We're going to get that just a second, where he says about brain fart. Where he says about we have better hopes for you. So we get to verse 32, and it says, "Remember the earlier days." Now this is kind of funny, but whatever. He's referencing once again the Song of Moses, because in the Song of Moses in verse 7, it started off, "Remember the days of old." Did I write it down? Yes, I did. In Deuteronomy 32 is the same Song of Moses, but verse 7 says, "Remember the days of old." So he just cited chapter 32, and remember, he's drawing attention to that whole section. And so then he starts off verse 32 by saying, "Remember the earlier days," which is obviously going to draw their attention to that passage in Deuteronomy. So don't forget where you came from, your heritage of faith, and what God has done. Remember the earlier days when after you had been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. So you had gotten saved, and genuinely saved, and then you went through all this stuff, and you endured all that. Remember that. And don't let your sacrifice in those times be wasted, be lost. You went through so much, it would be terrible to have gone through all that for nothing. So then we get to verses 32 through 34, and it says, "Sometimes you were publicly exposed to taunts and afflictions, and at other times you were companions of those who were treated that way. For you sympathized with the prisoners and accepted with joy the confiscation of your possessions, because you know that you yourselves have a better and enduring possession." Not because you knew, but because you know that you yourselves have a better and enduring possession. Once again, drawing their attention to the future. So there's a few things. There's 4 things here that he mentions that they've gone through. I'll break them down. Number 1, they experienced public abuse, both with being mistreated physically and being maybe verbally assaulted. So a wide range of different stuff there. Second thing off, they were among others who were also being publicly mistreated. So basically, let's say me and Todd are both out in the streets witnessing, and Todd gets beaten, and I'm sitting there with Todd watching, right? Okay, so then the third thing that he says is those who weren't arrested were still being supportive of those who were being arrested, so they were unified, they had camaraderie. And then the fourth thing, that they were evicted from Rome. And he says this, not in so many words. He says, "You sympathized with prisoners and accepted with joy the confiscation of your possessions." He's referring here to when Rome evicted all the Jews. And the reason why they were evicted was because of the whole Christian controversy, because they were wondering, is this a cult of Judaism? Or are these people Jews or what? So they just evicted the Jews. And this is actually where Paul meets 2 very influential people. Priscilla, no. Okay, the two people that lied to the Holy Spirit, what was their names? That they were struck dead? In the book of Acts, there's 2 people, a husband and wife, and they lied to the Holy Spirit, and then they're struck dead. Their names are... You know who I'm talking about. Okay. So I get their names confused with these other people's names. Was that Priscilla and Aquila, or was that... Yeah, okay. Yes, Ananias and Sapphira, those are the 2. Those are the ones. You have read that right there. So those are the ones that, okay, so then it must have been Priscilla and Aquila. Anyways, sorry guys, I can't remember this right now. It'll come to me probably right when I lay my head down to go to sleep. There's this husband and wife that Paul meets in the book of Acts, and they go on to teach. There's this guy... oh, it's really bugging me that I can't remember these names right now. There's this guy that he's teaching, but they take him aside and teach him the ways of God more accurately. And it's the husband and wife, those people. They become Paul's friends. They were actually some of the Jews that were evicted from Rome that Paul met there. And so this is this whole thing that he's talking about, he's referencing that same eviction. And this is also the same reason that caused a huge problem in Rome, which is why Paul wrote the book of Romans to a church that he'd never even been to, because the Jews had been out of Rome for so long that the church was almost entirely Gentile. And so when the Jews finally were allowed to come back to Rome, there was a huge division in the church between the Jews and the Gentiles. And so Paul writes the entire book of Romans to address this issue because even though he'd never even been there. So you see that, and this causes a huge issue. What are you looking at? What are you pointing at?
You know, the husband and wife.
Yeah, Ananias and Sapphira. Yeah, that's what Darla was saying. So, okay, where am I at here? So, one thing we need to look at before we move on from verse 34 is it says this. It says, "For you sympathize with the prisoners and accepted with joy the confiscation." The joy part is the thing that I want to focus on. How did they have this joy? Because remember, we've talked about this before. I'm sure you've heard it a dozen times. The difference between joy and happiness. He's not talking about happiness. He's talking about joy. So how did they get this joy in the middle of all their persecution and loss and all these bad things that were happening? He says here that the joy, because you know that you yourselves have a better and enduring possession. So the source of their joy was because of their future hope. That same future hope, which could become a terror if they abandon Jesus, is the same future hope that they did these things and endured these things with such joy before. So the same thing, and then we're going to get to this in just a second, but the same thing can be both a terror and an encouragement. And in this part, he's showing about how before it was a joy to them, but that same thing can also cause them mass panic, terror, if they abandon the way. And I thought that it was funny that when we get lost in struggles nowadays, we look for distractions, like we watch a bunch of Netflix or we play video games or whatever. But here, their source of that joy was thinking about what was coming. And, you know, it wasn't having a day of just binge watching. Here's the thing. It's something crazy. We get really bogged down and need a rest. So we sit down in our houses all day and watch Netflix and think that that's going to make us, maybe you don't watch Netflix. I'm talking about me, okay? So if you don't watch Netflix, don't worry about it. And we do this thing, it can be Netflix or any other thing, where, you know, and so we're sitting there watching all day to help us relax and rejuvenate, but it just makes us feel more and more irritated, so that the next day when we go back to work, we feel even more irritated than we did before the rest. You know, and there's different kinds of rest, and that's a conversation for another different day, but I find it funny here that their source of joy in the middle of these things, they didn't just tap out or watch Netflix. They kept their eyes focused on the future of what was happening. And so there's one thing we need to mention about that, and that's suicide. So for a long time, suicide was taught as a sin that will send you to hell. I personally don't believe that, but I understand how people could believe that. However, there's something very, very, very important about suicide that I would like to mention, and that's that suicide is never shown as a realistic option of faith and obedience in God. Never once in the whole Bible is it shown. You see God's people going through bad things, having mental issues a lot of times, or health issues, going through these things that are really rough, that there's no clear way of escape, but you never once see suicide given as a realistic option. And nowadays, suicide is oftentimes touted as almost like a mercy thing, like a mercy killing, like hey, if life is too hard, don't worry about it. Suicide's always there for you. And that's not the biblical model that we see. Rather, what we see is endurance is always 100% shown as the way of faith and obedience. It's always shown as endurance. Never once as suicide, always endurance. The different biblical authors always say, for this reason you need to endure. He just said that in Hebrews, or talk about it in James, where he says, you need to let this run its course so you'll learn endurance. And there's always these things about endurance, but never suicide. So I just want to throw that out there just in case you deal with any people who are suicidal. So we get to verse 35, and it says, "So don't throw away your confidence, which has a great reward." Now this is very confusing. If you're still looking at the Bible as an emotional book written in the 2020s, okay? Remember, we live in an emotional culture. They didn't, okay? Well, they did. Well, that's a conversation for another day. But you define everything nowadays is what I'm getting at, by emotion. And that's not necessarily the case from back there. So when it says don't throw away your confidence, what that means, confidence is public boldness. Don't throw away your public boldness. Don't stop being bold in public for what you're doing, because God is going to reward it. Okay? Not necessarily that your feelings are going to be there, but God is going to reward it. So don't throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. Okay, so that takes us to a common cop-out that a lot of times we throw out there, where people say something along the lines of this: God knows my heart, right? Have you guys ever heard people say that? Well, God knows my heart. Here's the thing about that, okay? Yes, that's true. God does know your heart. But there has to be something eventually somewhere that follows from your hands. Because no matter how genuine you think your heart is, if there's nothing that follows from that, it's not genuine, right? I could say, I believe in Jesus. I'm not going to obey him. I'm not going to live for him. I'm not going to... See, so in what way do I believe in Jesus? Well, in my heart, I have a tingle. Well, that's great, but that tingle is not going to save you. It always connects the idea of what's happening in the heart having a realistic component in the real world. It always does that in the Bible. So verse 36, and we're getting towards the end of this, says this: For you need endurance, so that after you have done God's will, you may receive what was promised. And that takes us all the way circled to the question I asked at the very beginning. It seems, based on this verse at least, there are other verses, but let's just focus on this one. It seems that the promise of the word comes after we endure, not before we endure. So, it's not those who start the race, but those who finish the race. Another way of saying that, you need to keep going lest your going be in vain. If you don't keep going, you're going to get to the end. It's not going to have anything to show for it. So also we see that it's God's will that we continue on instead of giving up. God doesn't desire that we give up or quit or leave with hurt feelings or commit suicide. He doesn't desire those things. For you need endurance so that after you have done God's will, you can't do God's will if you're dead, right? Right? So we get to verses 37 to 38, and they say this: For yet in a very little while the coming one will come and not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith, and if he draws back, I have no pleasure in him. So these are actually two different verses here. The first one is it's from Isaiah 26, and it's kind of a more section that's taken out, but that whole part there is talking about God's coming wrath. And it's also Habakkuk 2, verses probably 3 or somewhere around there. And they're just kind of spliced together. Excuse me. And this here, we see again here the contrast of the same event being both good and bad. This is the second time that we're looking at this tonight, okay? So what's good for some is bad for others. Look at this. In a very little while, the coming one will come and not delay. Is that good or bad? Is it good that Jesus comes again, or is it not good? Well, it depends which side of the coin you're on, doesn't it? So then we get to the next verse, and it says this: But my righteous one will live by faith, and if he draws back, I have no pleasure in him. So for the one that he has no pleasure in, it's not a very good thing. But for the one who doesn't shrink back, he has a lot of pleasure in. So the same event can be both good and bad. Like the fire of God, is that a good or a bad thing? Well, it depends what side of the equation you're on. And so yes, we want to make sure we're on the right side. So Jesus' return seems delayed nowadays, doesn't it? And a lot of people talk about this, how Jesus delay his return. They've been talking about this for 2,000 years. A lot of people think it's because of this or that, and there's a lot of times when you go online that people are even going to give these real convoluted things about why Jesus hasn't come back. We haven't done this, or we need to do this, or we need to pray this, right? But here's the thing that I would argue, based off of what Habakkuk just told us. When it's Jesus' appointed time to come back, he will come back. Just like the first coming. When it's his appointed time. Let's look once again at Habakkuk, keeping in mind that this is referencing the end times. In a very little while, the coming one will come and not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith, and if he draws back, I have no pleasure in him. Okay. Now, if you remember this part of Habakkuk, he says this right after this part. He says this: write it down on a tablet. Write it down and wait. Because, though it delays, wait for it. The appointed time will come. That's this exact same part that he's quoting here. This exact same thing. So that argues not just that Jesus' first coming was appointed, not just that the judgment of Israel and Judah was appointed, but also that his second coming is appointed. It's not going to be something that I can pray the perfect prayer, do this, and that will force Jesus to come back. No. You're also not going to be able to stop Jesus from coming back like, well, I'll just keep praying that Jesus won't come back, and then he won't come back. What? Like, you can't do that, okay? We don't have control over that. So that brings us to a few last ideas here before we close out. The first one being that the righteous are those who live by faith. What makes you righteous? You live by faith. And also notice that the righteous person is contrasted. You would think that it's going to contrast the righteous with the wicked, right? Isn't that what he does in the book of Proverbs, for instance? But that's not what he does. He didn't contrast the righteous with the wicked. He contrasted the righteous with those who shrink or draw back. Let's go back and read it one more time. My righteous one will live by faith, and if he draws back, I have no pleasure in him. We're not talking about the righteous versus the wicked of the culture. We're not talking about the church versus America. We're not talking about the church versus the world. We're talking about the Christians versus the apostasy of Christians. Because remember, as the end draws closer and closer, there's going to be a bigger and bigger apostasy. There's going to be a bigger and bigger falling away. Not a smaller one. There's going to be a bigger and bigger false church, even as the end comes. So it's all about those who endure and those who don't. Now, this is something I want to draw attention to. It's not about how well you started the race. It's about finishing the race well. Doesn't matter what you did 20 years ago. Doesn't matter what I did when I was a kid. It doesn't matter how well you started the race. It's about finishing the race. Very important. And for this, I want to draw attention to a story that all of you are familiar with. I'm not going to tell the whole story because it's getting late. But in Genesis, probably around maybe chapter 19 or so, there's a story about Lot. And Sodom and Gomorrah is about to get destroyed. The two big evil cities are about to get destroyed, annihilated, wiped off. And the angel gives this instruction. Go, don't turn back. Very, very clear. And then it says that Lot's wife turned back and turned into a pillar. And then we ran with our imaginations. Instead of trying to understand the grammar, the Hebrew grammar, we just said, so she looked back and turned into salt. Well, that's probably not what's being said. The word there in the Hebrew is more talking about not looking back, but turning back. And the idea isn't that she saw, because remember, there's all kinds of cities in that whole area that saw the destruction, and they weren't turned to salt, right? But the word there is not used all over the place for looking. It's for turning. Lot's wife turned back to go back to Sodom and Gomorrah, and she was turned into salt when the city was turned to salt. It was destroyed. She was caught in the destruction because she went back. And Jesus actually draws references in Luke where he says, he starts talking about Lot, and then he talks about going back inside for the thing, remember Lot's wife. Well, why would he reference that if Lot's wife didn't actually go back, if she just looked back? Because I've been in constant paranoia my whole life thinking, because I didn't understand the Hebrew, thinking that if you just so much as accidentally, like, I'm one of those people, if I'm not supposed to look at something, I have the hardest time not looking, you know, yeah, let's hope there's no reflective surfaces out here in the desert, you know? And that's really not what he's talking about. He's talking about turning back to go back. He's not talking about stumbling. He's talking about turning back. So it's the same thing we're talking about here. We're not talking about a Christian who's stumbling. We're talking about going back to Sodom and Gomorrah. Not looking back, going back, turning backwards. So their struggle was persecution, and oftentimes we dismiss this and say, I can't learn anything from this passage of Hebrews because I'm not going through persecution like they were. Here's the thing. We have a different kind of persecution today. It's called pleasure. And it is stealing the life and joy of the church. And we're allowing it because it feels good. It feels real good. So we are going through an equally difficult struggle, the struggle of self. Okay, don't discredit the struggle. We still need faith, and the righteous will live by that faith. And 39 says, this is the last verse, we are not those who draw back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and are saved. What does it mean to live by faith? It means to respond in faith. You're responding in faith. They face trials. They could shy back or respond in faith the same as we can. but God's righteous people are those who live and respond in faith. The summary of tonight, don't shrink back. Now, obviously, this is not the same as leaving a church, but many leave a church because they don't want to grow, they don't want to go forward, they don't want to change. A lot of times you see this over and over again. People, the church is moving forward, it's getting to a good place. I mentioned once again the story of John Maxwell's church. The church was growing, they were reaching their community, people were getting saved, and people left just because of that. Sometimes people leave a church for no other reason than they don't want to move forward. Not saying that they're going to lose their salvation over it. I'm just saying we are called not to shrink back. Let us not be of those who shrink back. Let's move forward. Let's be on the train when God moves it out of the station.